It was a spring night in Liberty, Georgia. Quiet, familiar, and harmless, just like any other in the town of 5,312 people. At exactly 8 p.m., the old clock in the Collins family's living room ticked forward, its rhythmic sound echoing in an empty house. That clock would become a haunting symbol of time frozen in tragedy. Minutes later, a gas station camera recorded the last known image of 28-year-old Rebecca Collins stepping out of her gray-green Honda CR-V beneath harsh, fluorescent lights. She was wearing a light checkered shirt, simple jeans, and her long dark hair was pulled back as she hurriedly smiled at the cashier. That moment, captured at 8:05 p.m., would be the final time anyone saw her alive. She never made it to her mother's house for dinner, something she had never once missed. Her car vanished, her phone went silent, and Liberty descended into confusion and fear. What happened in the narrow 5-minute window between that gas station and Hollow Creek would ignite a mystery that consumed the town for the next 17 years. This is the story of a woman who disappeared without a trace, a case that froze in time, a mother who never stopped searching, and a killer who stood beside the family at memorials while hiding a terrible truth. How did Rebecca's car, her body, and the truth stay hidden beneath the surface for almost 2 decades? And how did science, persistence, and justice finally catch up with a man who thought the past would stay buried? Why did a seemingly harmless man from the neighborhood attend candlelight vigils and offer support, knowing he had secrets to hide? And how did a single strand of hair and a broken fingernail change the entire course of a cold case? If you want to uncover the answers to these haunting questions, then like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Tell us in the comments from which city you are watching this cold case story, and help us reach 5,000 likes to continue telling these forgotten stories that deserve justice. May 14, 2006 began just like any other Sunday in Liberty. Warm sunlight danced through the pine trees lining Highway 84, and the air smelled faintly of honeysuckle and fresh-cut grass. Rebecca Collins, a local accountant, had spent her morning attending church, then stopped briefly at her apartment, before heading out to her mother Linda's white-tiled house for dinner. She had done this every Sunday for years. Her presence was as expected as the setting sun. She wore her usual soft-toned clothes, always neat, always comfortable. Her car, a gray-green Honda CR-V, was clean and familiar, often seen parked outside her office on weekdays and her mother's house on weekends. At 8:05 p.m., the gas station camera on Highway 84 captured a blurry but clear image of Rebecca filling up her tank. She seemed rushed, maybe tired, but not distressed. The cashier later recalled her brief smile, her usual politeness, and the soft click of her boots on the floor as she walked out. No one noticed anything strange. No one followed her. At least, not that anyone saw. And yet, by the time Linda Collins set the dinner table and glanced nervously at the door, something had already gone terribly wrong. Within hours, Rebecca's absence went from unusual to alarming. Phone calls rang unanswered. Texts remained unread. The town that often fell asleep by 9 found itself holding its breath by midnight. The next morning, Linda walked into the Liberty County Sheriff's office, her hands shaking, her voice unsteady, and reported her daughter missing. That report would be the beginning of a mystery that would spiral into silence, error, heartbreak, and eventually, justice. The clock inside Linda Collins' home ticked past 9 p.m., and still, there was no sign of her daughter. Rebecca never missed Sunday dinner. She had always arrived on time, sometimes even early, bringing with her a small bag of groceries or her favorite strawberry jam for breakfast the next morning. But that night, the kitchen stayed quiet, the food on the table untouched, and the house filled with a creeping sense of dread. Linda called her daughter's phone once, twice, 3 times. Each time it rang, the dial tone holding onto a fragile thread of hope. But then, after the 4th call, the line went silent. No ringing. No voicemail, just silence. And with that silence came a terrible weight Linda could not shake. At first, Linda tried to convince herself that maybe Rebecca got delayed. perhaps a flat tire, or maybe she decided to stop by the church. But as midnight passed and the familiar hum of her daughter's car never came up the driveway, the fear became real. She sat in the living room with the porch light still on, glancing out the window every few minutes hoping to see headlights. But there was nothing. Just the stillness of a Sunday night that felt wrong in every way. By morning, that quiet house became unbearable. Linda, who had never once imagined needing to speak these words, walked into the Liberty County Sheriff's office and said them aloud for the first time. "My daughter is missing." Her voice trembled. Her hands clutched a photograph taken just 2 weeks earlier, Rebecca standing outside her office in a pale blue blouse, smiling, unaware of what was to come. Sheriff Harold McKay, a seasoned officer with more than 2 decades of experience, took her report seriously from the start. He knew that the first few hours after a disappearance were everything, and this case, from the very beginning, felt different. The search began immediately. Flyers were printed and pinned to bulletin boards outside the diner, the post office, and the town's single grocery store. A photo of Rebecca, smiling at her college graduation, quickly became the image burned into every local's mind. Liberty had never seen something like this. Not here. Not to one of their own. At church services that week, her name was spoken, in every prayer. At coffee shops, people whispered theories and fears. At the school bus stop, parents held their children a little tighter. Rebecca Collins was not just someone's daughter. She was a part of this town's fabric. Quiet, kind, always smiling. And now she was gone. The media arrived quickly. Local reporters set up near the sheriff's office, filming live updates in front of the spreading wall of flyers and maps. Anchors repeated the same haunting phrase, last seen on May 14th at 8:05 p.m. at a gas station on Highway 84. Nothing after that, just vanished. In the following days, Liberty transformed. Residents offered to search nearby trails, wooded areas, and empty fields. Others brought food to the Collins home. Some simply sat beside Linda in quiet support. But no one had answers. Only questions. What could have happened in just a few minutes on a familiar road? Why would Rebecca vanish without a word? As worry deepened into fear, and fear turned into panic, one single thought grew louder in everyone's mind. What if someone took her? And if so, who would do such a thing in a town where everyone knows your name? The moment Rebecca's disappearance was confirmed, Sheriff Harold McKay knew this was not a case to delay. He had seen missing persons reports before, some ending in relief, others not. But this one felt different from the start. Rebecca Collins was responsible, steady, and deeply rooted in liberty. She would not vanish on her own. There were no signs of struggle, no warnings, and no goodbye. It was as if she had been erased. Within hours of the report, McKay issued an urgent search order. Deputies were dispatched along Highway 84 and the narrow roads leading off it. Each mile was treated like sacred ground. They checked shoulders, ditches, and tree lines, searching for any sign of skid marks, debris, or a vehicle hidden out of view. Patrol cars combed the area in wide loops while search and rescue teams walked side by side through dense pine woods, calling Rebecca's name again and again. But the woods gave no answers. The most significant breakthrough came from the phone. Company. Rebecca's last signal had pinged just south of Liberty, near a quiet place known as Hollow Creek. It was a stretch of man-made lake surrounded by tangled brush, steep inclines, and a few aging boat docks. A place locals knew well, peaceful during the day, haunting when the sun went down. That signal cut off abruptly at 8:17 p.m., only 12 minutes after the gas station footage had captured Rebecca fueling her car. That clue changed everything. Hollow Creek became the center of the search. Boats were deployed into the lake. Police dogs were brought in, sniffing for human scent near the dock edges and overgrown paths. Volunteers from Liberty and neighboring towns joined, some bringing flashlights, others helping with food and supplies. Even teenagers showed up with printed maps and water bottles, wanting to help find someone they had once passed in the grocery store or waved to outside the library. The lake, once calm and overlooked, became a place of tension and dread. Divers slipped beneath the surface using old sonar equipment to search the murky waters. But the lake was deep and deceptive, its muddy bottom swallowing anything that settled too long. After hours underwater, they emerged with nothing but algae, weeds, and tired expressions. The search teams widened their scope. Abandoned gravel pits, narrow dirt roads, and old hunting trails were checked one by one. That night, lights burned late inside the Liberty Sheriff's office. The caseboard was updated, the pins were moved, and the photo of Rebecca Collins was placed back at the center, no longer forgotten, no longer cold. All because a pair of muddy shoes still remembered what the world had tried to forget. And now, the search for the man behind that hidden DNA would lead investigators straight into the shadows of Liberty. With the DNA sample in hand, the GBI cold case team turned to a tool that had solved some of the most baffling mysteries of recent years: genetic genealogy. It was a method not available in 2006, but now it had become a powerful way to track down people through their bloodlines. The unknown male DNA found in the mud on Rebecca's shoes was strong, detailed, and ready to speak. Investigators uploaded the profile into GEDmatch, a public database filled with DNA from people all across the country who had taken tests to find relatives or trace their ancestry. The results took just a few days to return. Not a direct match, but enough to trace a pattern. Certain segments of the DNA linked back to individuals from Georgia, people from a widespread but connected family, one that had long roots in the Liberty area. The team began building a genetic tree, adding names, branching off cousins, siblings, second cousins, and finally narrowing it to a small cluster of men. One name stood out: Earl Patterson. He was 45 years old, still living in Liberty, still working in the same town he always had. His name was not unfamiliar. He had been lightly interviewed during the original investigation in 2006, not as a suspect, but as a background contact. Back then, Patterson had told police that he was working a night shift at a lumber mill nearly 20 miles away when Rebecca disappeared. His story had been brief, and because the investigators were focused so heavily on Mark Ellison, Patterson's words were accepted at face value. His name was crossed off with little more than a line in the report. But now, the DNA said something very different. The cold case team pulled Patterson's old interview notes, scanned the original timeline, and reviewed everything with fresh eyes. They also revisited his cell phone data, this time using modern mapping software that could reconstruct precise movements using old tower logs. What they found erased all doubt. Patterson's phone had never pinged near the lumber mill that night. Instead, it connected to a tower close to Hollow Creek, at almost the exact time Rebecca's phone signal vanished. The place where her car was never found. The place where her trail had gone cold. That meant Patterson had lied. And he had lied from the very beginning. The team did not stop there. They built a timeline of his life. Where he worked, where he lived, who he knew. And one disturbing fact stood out. Patterson had attended some of the early vigils for Rebecca. He had stood near the Collins family, lit candles, whispered prayers, pretended to care. And all that time, the truth had been buried beneath the mud and silence. The forensic analyst who first flagged the DNA match said it best. "We found the leaf. Now we have followed it to the branch, and now we are staring directly at the root." The man whose DNA was found on Rebecca's shoes, the man whose phone was near Hollow Creek, the man who had slipped through the cracks while wearing a mask of innocence, Earl Patterson. And as investigators stared at his name, a deep stillness filled the room. A quiet understanding that after all these years, they were finally standing face to face with the man who had never been a suspect, but should have been. What they would uncover about his past movements and his quiet life would shake the entire town of Liberty to its core. Once Earl Patterson's name rose to the surface, the cold case team knew they had to go back to where it all began, Hollow Creek. That was the place Rebecca's phone had last signaled. The place Patterson's own phone had been traced. The place that, for 16 years, had held its silence beneath still water. In 2006, searches of the lake had been done using basic sonar and limited diving equipment. At the time, nothing was found. But technology had changed, and now, with the help of a volunteer sonar team that specialized in deep water recoveries, the search was about to begin again. On an early morning in August 2022, boats quietly glided across the lake's calm surface. The team worked methodically, dragging side-scan sonar devices across the area where Rebecca's signal had last been recorded. It did not take long. Just under 2 hours in, a shadow appeared on the sonar screen. It was faint, but unmistakable. A rectangular shape about the size of a compact SUV, lying tilted at the bottom of the lake, roughly 60 yards from the main dock. The image showed a boxy frame, 4 corners where wheels would be, a structure long enough, wide enough, and buried just deep enough in mud to explain why it had never been seen before. One technician leaned forward and spoke in a quiet voice. "That is a car, and it has been down there a long time." A diver was sent down. The water was dark, thick with silt, and visibility was low. But through the murk, he saw it. A gray-green vehicle, the body coated in algae, the tires sunken into the lake bed. The Honda emblem was still barely visible beneath a layer of rust and decay. He placed a yellow marker buoy above it, then returned to the surface with one sentence that no one had said out loud for 16 years. "I think we found her." The car was lifted from the water the next morning. A crane mounted on a barge carefully raised the vehicle as onlookers stood silently along the shoreline. The metal creaked, the water churned, and slowly the Honda CR-V emerged from the lake, dripping and covered in mud. It was placed on a tarp and quickly sealed off behind yellow crime scene tape. Inside, the scene was heartbreaking. The doors were locked. The windows were cracked but not shattered. The interior was flooded and filled with debris, but the shape in the driver's seat was clear. Skeletal remains, still held in place by a seatbelt, still wearing fragments of clothing. The confirmation came within hours. The remains were those of Rebecca Collins. The entire town of Liberty held its breath. Personal items were recovered from inside the vehicle. A black purse, a wallet with worn identification, Rebecca's work badge, a small water-damaged notebook with barely legible pages. One entry stood out, written on May 13th, one day before she vanished. It said she had planned to meet someone, to talk. That one line chilled everyone who read it. But there was more, and it was even more damning. DNA samples were taken from inside the car, from the seatbelt, the passenger seat, the fabric of Rebecca's jacket. Some were expected, her own, mixed with time and lake sediment, but others were not. Among the samples, short brown hairs and skin cells were collected and preserved. Forensic tests confirmed the result with no room for doubt. The DNA belonged to Earl Patterson. His biological trace was inside Rebecca's car. He had been in it, touched it, left behind pieces of himself in the very place where she had died. It was not just a coincidence. It was proof. And now, with Rebecca found, with her car recovered, and with DNA pointing straight to the man who had hidden in plain sight for 16 years, the case had shifted from cold mystery to criminal certainty. What came next would not just be a search for answers. It would be a hunt for justice. With the car pulled from Hollow Creek and Earl Patterson's DNA confirmed inside, investigators knew they were close. But close was not enough. Not for court. Not for a murder case that had remained unsolved for 17 years. They needed more evidence, more connections, more proof that could not be denied or explained away. The cold case team turned its attention to Patterson's present life. He still lived quietly in Liberty, still worked at a local transport company, still acted like a man with nothing to hide. But behind that calm face, something darker was starting to unravel. A surveillance team was put in place. Unmarked cars rotated near his street. Investigators watched his routines, his grocery trips, his afternoons spent on the porch with a beer in hand. And then, late at night, they collected his trash. It was legal, it was quiet, and it was about to become the final piece of a puzzle. Inside those black garbage bags, investigators found cigarette butts, a half-empty water bottle, used tissues. Every item was carefully sealed and sent to the GBI forensic lab. The results came back fast. The DNA on the cigarette matched perfectly with the sample pulled from Rebecca's car. It was a 100% match to the same profile found on her jacket, her seatbelt, and deep in the fabric of the passenger seat. It was another layer of truth, and one that could not be denied. Still, the team pressed further. They pulled Earl Patterson's work records from the lumber mill where he claimed to be on the night Rebecca disappeared. And there it was, the missing piece that had been overlooked in 2006. His timesheet showed he had taken 3 days off that week. No late shift, no overtime, no proof that he was anywhere but in Liberty. When questioned in the original investigation, he had said he worked that night, but the documents said otherwise. And the cell tower data? That sealed it. His phone never connected to the tower near the mill. Instead, it pinged close to Hollow Creek, close to the very place where Rebecca's phone had gone dark. His lie was not just a mistake. It was a move to hide something only he knew. The final blow came from an unexpected place, a memory from across the street. Alice Montgomery, Patterson's former neighbor, still lived in the same small house she had back in 2006. When officers visited her with a photo of Rebecca's gray-green Honda CR-V, her expression shifted. Her voice trembled. "I saw that car. That night, it was parked near his house. The headlights shone right through my living room window. I remember wondering who it belonged to. It was not much, just a single statement, but it placed Rebecca's vehicle near Patterson's house on the very night she vanished. When layered with the DNA, the cell records, and the false work log, it formed a wall of evidence. For years, Earl Patterson had walked through Liberty as a quiet neighbor, a man who offered sympathy, who joined the search, who lit candles beside Rebecca's grieving mother. But now every step he had taken was being retraced, and every lie was being exposed. What no one knew yet was how far Patterson had gone to keep his secret buried. By March of 2023, the walls around Earl Patterson had closed in. The cold case team had everything they needed. DNA inside the car, a false work alibi, cell tower data that placed him at Hollow Creek, a neighbor who remembered Rebecca's vehicle near his yard, and now fresh DNA from his trash that matched the crime scene exactly. The weight of it all could no longer be ignored. It was time to act. On the morning of March 18th, just after sunrise, unmarked patrol cars moved quietly through Patterson's neighborhood. Officers surrounded his home without sirens. Sheriff Cynthia Hayes, who had carried this case with quiet determination, stood near the lead vehicle holding the arrest warrant. At exactly 6:12 a.m., Patterson stepped out onto his porch wearing a thin sweatshirt and pajama pants, reaching for the morning newspaper. That was when it happened. He was approached by officers and informed that he was under arrest for the murder of Rebecca Collins. His face turned pale. He did not run. He did not speak. He simply froze, his hands raised slightly as they placed the cuffs around his wrists. As neighbors watched from their porches and windows, whispers spread fast. The man who had walked among them year after year now stood exposed. Patterson was transported to the GBI's regional office in Atlanta for formal interrogation. The room was bare, metal table, harsh lighting, and a camera recording every second. For the next 12 hours, 2 seasoned investigators questioned him. Behind a one-way mirror, prosecutors and forensic analysts watched in silence. At first, Patterson denied everything. He folded his arms, stared down, and repeated the same line. I do not know anything about Rebecca Collins, but the investigators had come prepared. They slid photo after photo across the table. Rebecca's car being pulled from the lake, the DNA report showing his biological trace on her seatbelt, the cigarette butt from his trash, the cell tower map. He began to falter. He claimed again that he had been at the lumber mill that night. But when they showed him the timesheet marked with 3 days off, his tone shifted. He rubbed his hands together. His eyes darted. Then came his second story. He said he had been sick and stayed home. Alone. The investigators leaned in. Then why was your phone near Hollow Creek at the exact time Rebecca's phone went dark? Patterson paused, took a breath, then changed his story again. He said Rebecca had called him. She had been upset and wanted to talk. He agreed to meet her at the lake, said they talked for a few minutes, said she drove away, and that was the last time he saw her. When asked why, he never told police any of this in 2006, he said he was afraid. Afraid he would be blamed, afraid no one would believe him. Then investigators asked the hardest question. If she drove away, why was your DNA on the passenger seat, the gear shift, and her jacket? Patterson went quiet. By the end of the interrogation, he had changed his story 3 different times, from complete denial to being homesick, to suddenly remembering a lakeside conversation with the very woman who had disappeared. He admitted to meeting her, admitted to being at the lake, but never admitted to taking her life. Still, his words no longer mattered. The evidence was louder than anything he could say, and as he sat slouched in the metal chair, sweat on his brow, his silence spoke what his mouth could not. Now, with a confession of presence and proof of lies, all eyes turned to the courtroom, where every truth and every hidden detail would finally be revealed. By the time January arrived in 2024, the town of Liberty had changed. For years, the name Rebecca Collins had been whispered with sorrow, her story carried in folded newspaper clippings and fading memory. But now, her name echoed through courtrooms and headlines, because Earl Patterson, the man who had once stood silently at her memorials, was finally on trial for her murder. The courthouse filled quickly on the first morning. Reporters from across the state arrived. Locals stood in quiet lines hoping to find a seat inside. Linda Collins sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, a photograph of Rebecca tucked into her purse. Beside her, Daniel, now a grown man, kept his eyes locked forward. The moment they had waited 17 years for was finally here. The prosecution began with no hesitation. Lead prosecutor Marcus Whitfield stood before the jury, his voice calm and steady. He laid out the facts. DNA found inside the car, DNA on the jacket, on the seatbelt, DNA recovered from Patterson's trash and matched by 2 different labs. A timesheet that proved Patterson lied. Cell tower data that placed him exactly where Rebecca's phone had gone dark. A neighbor who saw her car parked near his house that night. Each piece, one after another, woven into a single undeniable story. The courtroom listened in silence as sonar images were displayed on the screen. The blurred outline of Rebecca's Honda CR-V resting in the lake. Then, the recovery. Footage. Mud dripping from the roof, the door creaking open, the shape in the driver's seat still seat-belted in. A room full of strangers held their breath as the forensic analyst explained how her body had remained preserved by the cold lake bed, and how inside that car, evidence had survived long enough to speak. But then came the defense. Earl Patterson's lawyer, Daniel Groves, stepped forward slowly. His tone was softer. He reminded the jury that 17 years had passed, that memories fade, that technology, while powerful, was not always perfect. He questioned whether the DNA could have been transferred in some unknown way. He challenged the timeline, suggested that maybe Rebecca met others that night. Maybe Patterson left the lake before anything happened. He reminded everyone that his client had never confessed to murder, only to fear, only to panic. It was a battle of voices, one built on science, data, and facts, the other leaning on doubt, time, and gaps in memory. When it was time for Linda Collins to speak, the courtroom shifted. She stepped to the witness stand slowly. Her voice was soft, but every word carried pain and truth. She spoke of the phone calls that went unanswered, the meals that went cold, the porch light that stayed on night after night. She told the jury that her daughter never ran, never hid, never broke her word. Daniel followed. His voice was steadier, his anger more visible. He told them about the man who stood beside their family at prayer circles, the man who offered kind words while hiding what he had done. He said they had been living in a nightmare, one that only the truth could end. And as he spoke, many in the courtroom wept. The trial stretched over several days, each hour filled with arguments, charts, and the haunting presence of a girl who had once just been on her way to dinner. And when it ended, the jury was left with a single question. Would the weight of truth carry further than the silence of time? The answer would come behind closed doors, and it would shake liberty forever. Thereby, jury took their seats behind the closed wooden doors of the deliberation room, their faces tense and thoughtful. They had listened to hours of arguments, seen chilling images, and heard the raw pain in Linda and Daniel Collins' voices. Now the weight of justice rested in their hands. The courtroom sat still as time crawled. 6 hours passed. Then finally, the door opened. Everyone inside the courtroom rose. The foreman walked slowly to the front, holding the sealed envelope. Judge Harriet Boone asked the question the entire town had been waiting years to hear. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman gave a single nod. Yes, Your Honor. The envelope was opened. The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. And then, in one steady voice, the words were read aloud. We find the defendant, Earl Patterson, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Rebecca Collins. Gasps echoed around the room. Some wept quietly. Others simply closed their eyes. Linda Collins clutched the photo of her daughter tighter, her shoulders shaking as Daniel wrapped his arm around her. Tears flowed, but this time they carried a different weight. It was not just grief. It was the release of 17 years of unanswered questions. Earl Patterson sat motionless, pale, silent, his head low. The man who had kept a mask of innocence for over a decade now faced the full judgment of truth. Judge Boone lifted her gavel and began the sentencing. Her voice was clear and firm. She spoke of the evidence, the years of lies, the pain inflicted on an entire community, and the dignity of a mother who never gave up. Then she declared the sentence. Earl Patterson is to serve life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck 3 times. It was over. A sound of applause rose. Quiet but powerful, not a celebration but a thank you, a way to honor Rebecca, and to acknowledge the strength it took for her family and her town to never let her memory disappear. Outside the courthouse, hundreds had gathered. Some held candles, some held signs with Rebecca's name. The courthouse steps became a place of mourning and healing all at once. Linda, now with tears in her eyes and strength in her voice, stepped forward to speak to reporters. Justice may have taken 17 years, she said, but today my daughter's voice was heard. The man who had stood beside them, joined their prayers, and watched their suffering in silence had finally been unmasked. But even with a verdict and a sentence, Liberty still had something to learn. Something deeper about how this case had slipped through the cracks for so long. The trial was over. The courtroom was silent. Earl Patterson was behind bars, sentenced to live out his days in a prison cell, far from the streets he had once walked without suspicion. But for the town of Liberty, the story of Rebecca Collins was not something that would fade with headlines. It had left a permanent mark, one that ran deeper than a verdict. In the spring of 2024, just weeks after the sentencing, a memorial was quietly built near the edge of Hollow Creek, the same place where Rebecca's car had rested in darkness. For 16 long years now stood in quiet honor. A simple plaque made of polished stone bore her name, Rebecca Collins, 1978 to 2006. At last, the truth is seen. Beneath the plaque, people placed fresh flowers. Some left notes. Others simply stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the water that once kept her hidden. Liberty had never built a memorial like it before. And now, it had become a place where people came not just to remember, but to learn. Local schools began including the Rebecca Collins case in their criminology and civic lessons. Students studied the investigation, not just for its outcome, but for what went wrong. How a wrong assumption delayed justice. How forgotten evidence sat quietly, waiting for someone to look again. And how science, persistence, and a mother's love brought light to even the darkest places. Linda Collins, now older, with gray in her hair and deep lines on her face, was honored at the town hall. They called her the heart of the case, the reason Rebecca was never forgotten. She stood at the podium, holding her daughter's photo in her hands. "I had nothing else left to give her," she said softly. "So I gave her my voice. And I never stopped speaking her name." The audience stood and applauded for minutes. Rebecca's story became more than a tragedy. It became a warning, a symbol, a reminder that behind every cold case is a family still waiting, a mother still hoping, a community still whispering a name. And through all the silence, the delays, the mistakes, one truth remained. Justice may take time, but it does not vanish. It waits, quietly, until someone is willing to see it through. Rebecca Collins was not forgotten. She was found. And in that discovery, liberty found itself too. If you are still watching this story, it means you felt something. Maybe pain, maybe anger, maybe hope. But if this story moved you even a little, then please like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. And help us complete our goal of 5,000 likes, because this was the number set by my mother, and I promised her I would reach it. It costs nothing, but it means everything. And tell me in the comments, from which city are you watching this cold case story? Let us keep stories like Rebecca's alive, because sometimes justice is not loud, it is patient, it is quiet, and it waits until the right hand set it free.